It all gets old, doesn't it? You know, all the fighting, the arguments, the accusations, the pettiness. It really is absolutely ridiculous. And what am I talking about? Well, I'm talking about the current situation politically in the country. It is like we are run by rebellious children in adult clothes that have not learned lessons in etiquette, how to deal with one another, how to treat one another, and how to be honest. And what comes with that is an environment of bitterness, accusation, and distrust. Now, you have to ask yourself, why is it we're here, right? How did we get here? Is there any other time in history where we can find an environment that is like this, either in our own country or in the history of other countries? And, you know, you have to look at it and kind of say, well, actually, there is. And it's a pattern throughout history. One that's often talked about in the prophets in the Old Testament. Book of Isaiah is a great one for that, but also Jeremiah and Zechariah and really all of them, because they rose up as prophets during that time when Israel was dealing with exactly what we're dealing with right now. Same environment, just repackaged differently for our time period. It's a very interesting study, and it sheds a lot of light on how we got here and why. And that's something I'm going to dive into a lot more in the next few talks. So, you know, I hope that that will help put some of what we're seeing, some of the reality that we're having to endure into a proper light, into a perspective that might help you make sense of it, you know. Where so many people are going about their daily lives as if nothing else exists but them. Are you seeing people, hearing people, interacting with people that don't seem to be thinking? That don't seem to be thinking for themselves. And when you watch the news, what's your gut feeling? Do you feel like you're being manipulated sometimes? Or do you think it's pretty much right on the button, you know? I mean, after all, especially your local news, right? What if I were to tell you that it's a mixture of both? Both manufactured, completely scripted, and some real stuff. What'd you think about that? Well, I think a lot of you already know the answer. And I think a lot of you, if you're really honest, you would say, a great deal of what we're living in doesn't make sense, and it feels like that we're being manipulated all the time. And you are. And this is not a left or right thing. This is the binary simulacrum. This is what you have to escape in here and in your heart. This is the reality that is brainwashing and manipulating the public and the world at large. Now, the question you have to ask yourself is why? So a year ago today, we were knee-deep in lockdowns. Everybody was confused. Everybody was sequestered, right? And it seemed like that we were all imprisoned. We're also being fed a lot of misinformation, confusion. Everybody was forced onto digital platforms to interact, right? Digital platforms that had not, right, been secured. Now, think about this. Everybody got forced into digital platforms, right? Think Think about how much information was compromised. Think about how many business decisions were compromised, right? Operations. Think about how many people also suffered from a lack of, freedom, human interaction, right? Think about how that impacted everybody. Now add the confusion, the stress, the separation anxiety, right? The uncertainty, right? The financial difficulties, right? Combine all those things, right? What did you think would happen? I can tell you a year ago, look, when I was dealing with this stuff, it was interesting because, I started seeing the impacts on me. And so dealing with those things in terms of being in that kind of level of isolation with folks far away, right? I was stuck on a farm and about 25 miles from the nearest town. And the isolation alone has impacts that are incredibly detrimental. I mean, physically, it affected me physically. It affected me cognitively. It's interesting how we were all impacted by it, and what we're all dealing with now, trying to come out of it, with constant fear-mongering and constant, a still constant flow of confusion, right? And how divided we are. Now, consider for a moment if that was exactly what was intended. Now think about it. If you're going to actually, cause the kind of massive upheaval that we're all dealing with still, it's almost the perfect plan. So here we are, we're a fractured society. You've got people that are completely have lost their minds in their desire to control because of fear and confusion. People are financially devastated, right? Psychologically and physically devastated. And we're still dealing with the impacts of that. Now, ask yourself, if that was an act of war, what should the response be? If that was an act of war, what are the actual casualty numbers? All right? If that was an act of war, why is it, right, that we're not actually telling the American people exactly what it is and doing things to protect them from hostile influences? Now, when you see the level of fear and confusion, what occurred really is a coup. An overthrowing of people's ability to emotively deal with things, to handle the stress. It was a financial, economic coup, right? And now you've got lawfare and lawlessness running rampant, not just here in the United States, but around the world. But I want you to stop and think about what it was like a year ago for you. Where were you? How were you handling it? What were you thinking? What did you think things would be like a year from then? What did you think it would be like today? Things definitively changed. And, yes, we've got all kinds of things we can still eat, thankfully. But what were some of the opportunities that were missed during that time period to actually put things right back in terms of the whole country? So those are some of the things I want you to consider in terms of where we're at as a nation and where we are heading and where we could go, good and bad. And I want you to consider the impacts of the fracturing of the country politically, psychologically, socially, financially, and ask yourselves what's been gained and what's been lost. And ask yourselves why it is that one side in particular is so intent on silencing, censoring, and demonizing the other side. You see, the binary simulacrum works off of both polarities. But that's not going to suffice in being able to put the pieces back together. So if we're going to overcome things as we should, there's going to have to be real change, and that real change is going to have to start with each one of us and how we deal with one another. And it's also going to have to be a greater change, a shift from everybody taking offense to everything to people looking for ways to encourage and build one another up. If we don't do that, things will only get worse as the divide grows. That's why for years I've been talking about we have to have a national vision. Right? We have to have a vision for the entire country so everybody can come together and play a role. And I'm not talking about something that's contrived. I'm talking about something that brings all Americans together to solve the problems that we have collectively. By not having that unifying vision and not having a plan for the country that focuses the entire nation on where we can go, that's positive. What that leaves is a gap, and that gap leaves people vulnerable to very negative influences, both online and in real life, and it gives our enemies opportunities to drive that wedge between people's tribes and tongues, and nations for that matter, even more. Now, I know everybody's stressed. I know everybody's been impacted. The question is not whether everybody has been, but what are we going to do about it? Because no one is satisfied with where we're at as a nation. No one is happy with leadership. I'm out here every day. I mean, the top down. I mean, when I say one of the things about Babylon, when I use the word Babylon, right? Don't go the way of Babylon. Is the top down rigid structure, right? It's almost like you have a pantheon in a public and private sector lording over everybody else, right? And that creates downward pressures. And as you have those downward pressures, right, it abuses people, it uses people, and it breaks people. It breaks relationships down. It breaks the country down. All the things I've been warning about, right? We have to address things as they are, not as we'd like them to be. That's your starting point. Now you can project out what you would like them to be, but unless it's something that brings everybody together, if we're only going to remain in our tribalism, right, in our industry silos, in our bureaucratic, skiffs, that will not suffice to change the paradigm where we need to go as a nation. So, as things unwind and you see, calamities increase, and you see a testing occurring of all the nations, right? All the peoples, tribes, tongues, and nations, and organizations and companies, right? And leadership, right? You're seeing what happens when some, right, do what's right in their own eyes, right? You're seeing what the consequences of leading with fear and confusion create. My concern is that the chaos that's been created, right, is going to birth something that is much darker and destructive for the majority of people, while emboldening and continue to profit a very small group of people around the world and here in the United States. I saw this coming a long time ago. I've talked about it. I've warned about it. So what I'm trying to tell you is we have to overcome these things in truth and love and justice and mercy from a positional humility. We have to help one another get over the stress, the fears, right? Bridge those gaps and encourage one another, right, to work together to solve our problems at every level in this society. One of the reasons I get so frustrated at Fauci and crew, not only is the confusion, but the arrogance, right, the fear, right? But it's also the fact that the public and private sector has done a poor job at working together, right, with people that have vision for the entirety of the country. That's not just a political statement, right? They wouldn't be doing that if they didn't have something to gain by doing it, right? So that should tell you where we're at. That should tell you what we're going to have to change. And we're going to have to do this with or without them on board, right? You know, when you look at what's happening in the West, you know, with all the fires, all of these things, for the most part, could have been prevented. There are a lot of things we could have done. But you see, people refuse to work together and everything's been politicized. That's not going to work. And it's even not, it's going to eventually, it is already beginning to turn against the very people that have the most wealth, power, influence, control, right? Because the masses are turning against them too. It's a zero-sum game. I can tell you where that convergence is and what the trend lines are saying. So I want you to consider these things in light of where we are today and where we were a year ago. And I want you to consider in light of, as it is for people, right? So too it is for organizations, companies, governments, the nation, and the nations.